Long before the story of an ark resting on distant mountains became familiar to millions, there was the deeper question that quietly lingers beneath the text of Genesis itself. Why does the account of the flood feel both particular and universal at the same time? Why does a story rooted in one family, one vessel, and one covenant seem to echo far beyond the pages of Scripture into the memories, myths, and traditions of cultures scattered across the world? As we open Genesis and walk slowly through its words, we are invited not only to witness the judgment and mercy of God, but to listen for the distant reverberations of an event that appears to have left a mark on all of humanity. Genesis presents the flood not as a myth told to entertain, nor as a detached legend, but as a sober account woven into the earliest memory of humanity's relationship with God. The narrative begins with a world that has drifted far from its intended harmony. Human violence fills the earth. Corruption is no longer isolated. It has become systemic, touching every layer of society. Scripture tells us that God sees this condition clearly, not with surprise, but with grief. The language is strikingly personal. God is described as being sorrowful, even pained, at what humanity has become. This is not a distant deity reacting coldly to disobedience. This is a creator responding to the unraveling of a creation meant for goodness. As we read carefully, we notice that the flood is not introduced abruptly. It emerges gradually from the moral state of the world. Genesis does not rush. It pauses to show us why the flood matters. The problem is not merely human wrongdoing, but a deep distortion of human purpose. Violence has replaced stewardship. Pride has displaced humility. Life itself has lost its sacredness. Into this broken world, Noah appears almost quietly. He is not introduced as a hero in the modern sense, but as a man who walks with God. In the midst of chaos, faithfulness still exists. This detail matters because it frames the flood not only as judgment, but as preservation. The ark, often the focus of imagination and art, occupies surprisingly little narrative space compared to the moral and spiritual meaning surrounding it. Genesis describes its dimensions and construction, but the emphasis remains on obedience and trust. Noah builds not because he understands everything, but because he listens. This quiet obedience stands in contrast to the surrounding world, which no longer listens at all. The ark becomes a vessel not only of survival, but of continuity. Through it, creation itself is carried forward. As the waters rise, the language of Genesis echoes the opening chapter of creation. The separation of land and sea is reversed. The boundaries that once brought order dissolve. The earth returns, temporarily, to a formless state. This literary echo is intentional. The flood is portrayed as a kind of uncreation, followed by the possibility of recreation. Yet even in this reversal, God's restraint is evident. The waters do not rage endlessly. They rise, they cover, and then they recede. Time is carefully marked. The narrative breathes with patience. When the waters finally withdraw and dry land reappears, the story does not end with destruction, but with covenant. God speaks words of promise, not only to Noah, but to all living creatures. The rainbow becomes a sign not of fear, but of remembrance. God binds himself to creation, declaring that such a flood will not happen again. This moment is deeply theological. It reveals a God who judges evil seriously, yet commits to sustaining life with mercy. The flood, then, is not merely about the past. It sets a framework for understanding God's ongoing relationship with the world. Yet the Genesis account does not stand alone in human memory. As we step back from the text and listen carefully to history, we discover that stories of a great flood appear across continents and cultures. Ancient Mesopotamia tells of Utnapishtim, warned of a divine flood and instructed to build a vessel. In India, ancient texts speak of Manu, guided by a divine fish to preserve life through overwhelming waters. Indigenous peoples of the Americas, from the Andes to North America, preserve oral traditions of a world covered by water, followed by renewal. Even in distant Pacific islands, flood narratives persist, passed down through generations. What is striking is not that these stories differ, but that they share core elements: a moral or spiritual cause, a warning, a chosen survivor or family, a vessel or place of refuge, the preservation of life, the renewal of the world. These shared features invite careful reflection. Could such widespread agreement arise purely by coincidence? Or do these stories point toward a shared ancestral memory, reshaped by time, language, and culture, yet rooted in a real and overwhelming experience? Genesis does not attempt to catalog these parallels, but it does provide a lens through which to view them. Scripture presents the flood as a global event with human-wide implications. If humanity once shared a common origin and memory, it would make sense for echoes of such a cataclysm to persist even as people spread and languages diverged. Over time, theology and storytelling would adapt to local cultures, but the core memory could remain. It is important, however, to approach these parallels with care. Genesis does not rely on external myths to validate its truth. Rather, it stands as a theological anchor, offering a clear moral and spiritual interpretation of an event remembered elsewhere in fragmented ways. Where other flood stories often portray the gods as capricious or annoyed, Genesis presents God as morally consistent, grieving over human corruption, yet committed to life. This distinction matters deeply. It reveals not only what happened, but why it mattered. As we reflect on the flood beyond the ark, we are drawn to consider the human condition itself. Why do flood stories resonate so deeply across cultures? Perhaps because they touch something fundamental in human experience: the fear of chaos, the memory of loss, and the hope of renewal. Water, in Scripture and beyond, is both life-giving and destructive. It cleanses, but it can also overwhelm. The flood gathers these meanings into one event, one memory, one turning point. Genesis invites us to read slowly here, to notice the balance between judgment and grace. God does not abandon the world. He intervenes to preserve it. The covenant after the flood is unconditional. It is not based on human perfection, but on divine commitment. This reveals something profound about God's character. Even when humanity fails repeatedly, God remains faithful to his purpose of sustaining life and guiding history toward redemption. The flood also speaks quietly to personal life. While we may never face rising waters that cover the earth, we do encounter moments of overwhelming change, loss, or disruption. The story of Noah reminds us that faithfulness is often practiced in obscurity, long before deliverance is visible. It invites us to trust God's guidance, even when the wider world seems indifferent or hostile to obedience. The ark, in this sense, becomes a symbol of trust built day by day, plank by plank. There's also a warning woven gently into the narrative. Genesis does not present the flood to frighten, but to awaken awareness. Human choices matter. Violence, injustice, and disregard for life have consequences. God's patience is real, but it is not indifference. The flood stands as a reminder that moral order is woven into the fabric of creation itself. As we listen to the ancient echoes of flood stories across the world, Genesis invites us to see them not as competing accounts, but as scattered reflections of a shared human past. The biblical narrative offers coherence, purpose, and hope within that memory. It anchors catastrophe within covenant and judgment within mercy. This is Bible Scope, your place to find light, find truth, and find purpose. If this journey speaks to your heart, like the video and subscribe to walk through Scripture with you as we come to the quiet end of this passage. We are left not with fear, but with reflection. What does the flood reveal about the seriousness of human choices and the depth of God's commitment to life? How does the covenant after the storm shape the way we understand hope after loss or renewal after failure? As we've walked through this passage, what truth stood out to you? How might it shape the way you live today? If this exploration helped you grow, like the video and subscribe. Your journey through the pages is just beginning.